The year is waning. The empire glows like a dying ember. In the marble courts of Rome, where laurel crowns gleam beneath the August sun, an old man feels the weight of gods pressing upon his chest. His name is Augustus, imperator, father of the nation, architect of peace. And yet, in the silence of his chambers, he hears only the cracking of that peace, like thin ice beneath an empire's feet. The myth is still intact. Rome believes itself eternal. Statues proclaim the triumphs of the past. Parthian standards returned. Egypt humbled, roads running like veins across the world. To the people, the Pax Romana is divine law, and Augustus its living embodiment. But behind the triumphal arches, the foundations tremble. The Teutoburg disaster, that accursed forest of mud and blood, has torn a hole through the illusion of invincibility. 3 legions, the pride of Rome, swallowed by barbarian woods. The bones of the dead lie beneath foreign trees, their eagle standards lost to German hands, and Augustus, too old to ride at the head of vengeance, paces within his marble palace, tearing at his hair, and crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." In the twilight of his reign, Augustus is both emperor and ghost, a man trapped in the mythology he created. Once, he had been the bright dawn after the storm of civil war, the youthful savior who ended the chaos of Caesar's murder. He transformed the Republic's corpse into an empire of marble, reshaping the world through order, spectacle, and the quiet violence of control. But time is no friend to gods. His body, ravaged by illness and age, bears the toll of divine burden. His face, still serene in public, is a mask stretched over exhaustion. Each decree, each festival, each speech before the Senate becomes a ritual to keep the illusion alive. Rome cannot see its god decay. His court hums with rehearsed loyalty. Senators flatter, poets sing of golden ages, and statues rise in his image, cold and perfect. Yet behind this theatre, the provinces whisper of taxation and revolt. Soldiers groan under endless campaigns. Famine and plague flicker like omens at the edges of empire. The peace he built is held together by spectacle, not conviction. Teutoburg was more than a defeat. It was revelation. For decades, Augustus had ruled through destiny, claiming that his victories were sanctioned by the heavens. But in the northern forests, the heavens were silent. The ambush had been total. Roman discipline devoured by nature's chaos. In his palace, maps are redrawn, not with expansion, but retreat. The Rhine becomes the new frontier, the boundary of ambition. Rome, that restless conqueror, is forced to pause. Augustus, once the bringer of eternal victory, now oversees the first limits of the imperial dream. He feels it acutely, the fragility of empire, the mortality of gods. No statue, no triumphal arch, can erase the knowledge that Rome can bleed. And so he hides his dread behind ritual. He orders sacrifices, builds temples to divine protection, and prays that marble might outlast fear. Publicly, Augustus remains the unshakable father of Rome. He appears in white robes, laurel crown shining, his gestures serene. The Senate rises as he enters. The people chant his name at the games. Even the gods, carved in stone, seem to bow. Yet the emperor is haunted by what he cannot control. The future. His heirs are dead or unworthy. Gaius and Lucius, the grandsons he had raised to inherit his glory, are gone. Julia, his daughter, has fallen from grace and into exile. His wife Livia whispers of Tiberius, the reluctant heir, the soldier who hides ambition behind obedience. Augustus feels himself surrounded not by family, but by players on a stage of power. Every face at court wears the same expression, reverence. But every gaze is a calculation. Behind the smiles lie rivalries that will outlive him. He dreams of the Republic's ghosts, Cicero, Pompey, even his murdered adoptive father Caesar, all shadows whispering that peace built on fear cannot endure. And in the deepest hour of night, when the torches gutter and the city murmurs beyond his window, Augustus wonders if he has become the very tyrant he once vowed to destroy. Rome itself mirrors the emperor. The marble that gleams under the sun is veined with fault lines, revolts in Pannonia, tax riots in the provinces, conscription bleeding dry the countryside. Each festival feels more desperate, each triumph more hollow. The populace cheers, but not from love, from habit. Bread and circuses dull the mind. while the machinery of empire grinds on. Statues of Augustus stand in every forum, his name carved upon every road, every coin stamped with his calm godlike face. Yet the living man behind that image feels smaller each day, shrinking before the very idea of himself. He has created a world too large for a mortal to sustain. His legacy now rules him. He once commanded men, now he commands myths, and myths, unlike men, demand perfection. The world waits for his death, not openly, but beneath the surface of every senator's smile, every soldier's salute. They wait to see what happens when the god dies, whether the marble will crack, whether the wolves of civil war will return to feed on the carcass of empire. Augustus knows this, and so in his final years, he clings not to power but to order, the rituals, the forms, the ceremonies that keep chaos at bay. He tells himself that the empire will endure because it must, because there is no other possibility, yet even he can feel it, the slow unraveling of destiny. The Pax Romana, that golden peace he once forged from blood and iron, has become a gilded cage. Its perfection is brittle, its silence ominous, and somewhere beyond the Rhine, in those endless forests, the wind still whispers through the bones of Rome's lost legions. Augustus, the man who turned chaos into empire, now stands as its prisoner. His reign began with fire and prophecy. It ends with ceremony and silence. The empire remains, vast and awe-inspiring, but its heart beats slower now. Rome's golden age was never peace, only the pause between storms. The marble gleams still, but beneath it, the old cracks widen. The empire's heart still beats, but it beats uneasily. Rome stands adorned with triumphs, temples to Augustus gleaming like the skin of a god. Yet inside those temples, the prayers have turned cold. The illusion of eternity persists, but within the imperial family, destiny is bleeding to death. The house of Caesar, once hailed as the vessel of divine succession, is crumbling from within. The names that once sang of promise, Gaius, Lucius, Julia, have turned to curses whispered in marble halls. The heirs whom Augustus loved, whom he moulded in the image of himself, are gone, dead too young, or banished in disgrace. The line of inheritance, once a radiant thread of divine favor, now twists into shadow and uncertainty. In this vacuum steps Tiberius, reluctant, grim, a soldier who never sought love but obedience. He has returned from the island of Rhodes, like a ghost recalled from exile, his presence both salvation and omen. To some, he is the only man capable of saving the empire from chaos. To others, he is the embodiment of it. He bows to Augustus with dutiful reverence, yet beneath that bow flickers resentment, the memory of years spent in forced obscurity, of being passed over for heirs who proved more fragile than marble. Livia Drusilla, the empress whose calm is a mask of calculation, stands between them. She is Rome's quiet puppeteer, weaving power through patience. The court moves to her rhythm, senators, generals, and family alike, drawn into the orbit of her composure. Her every gesture is deliberate, her silence a kind of dominion. While men fight for inheritance, Livia ensures the inheritance itself survives, for her blood, for her line. Augustus sees this, but he does not intervene. He is too old, too tired, and perhaps too aware that Livia's cunning is the only thing holding the dynasty together. He has witnessed the gods abandon families before, Caesar slain by his friends, Pompey betrayed, Mark Antony undone by his own desire, and he knows how fragile divine favor can be. His own life has been a dance with fortune. He no longer believes she is loyal. Tiberius moves carefully through the corridors of power. His victories in Germania and Illyricum have given him prestige, but not affection. Rome's citizens respect him as one respects a storm, necessary, inevitable, and frightening. He is a man who believes in the mechanics of duty, not the theatre of virtue. His face, carved from restraint, shows neither joy nor grief. To the public, he is the perfect servant of Augustus's will. To himself he is the empire's exile, recalled only when every other hope has died. Meanwhile, another name flickers in the darkness. Agrippa Postumus, the grandson of the great Agrippa, adopted by Augustus in a final attempt to restore his lineage. Once, he was meant to be the new dawn of the dynasty. Instead, he became its embarrassment. The boy grew into a brute, a creature of coarse strength and simpler pleasures, fishing, brawling, shouting his lineage like a drunkard boasts of debts unpaid. The court whispered that the gods had cursed his blood, that the grandson of Augustus was born without the emperor's restraint or intellect. Augustus, weary of the scandal, banished him to the island of Planasia, a paradise turned prison. There, surrounded by the sea's indifference, Agrippa's lineage became meaningless. His name was still written in the rolls of the imperial family, but in every practical sense, he was already erased. A living shadow, dangerous only because of what he once represented. The Roman court thrived on such shadows. The halls of power were filled with polite conspiracies, alliances stitched together with the thread of necessity. Men flattered Augustus while secretly courting Tiberius. Women traded gossip like daggers, their laughter echoing through marble chambers like warnings. Every gesture was a signal, every silence an accusation. To live in the imperial household was to breathe poison and call it incense. Julia the Younger, once the echo of her mother's scandal, drifts through this world like an unwanted memory. Her exile, the result of adultery and political embarrassment, is both punishment and warning. Augustus, whose public morality is the empire's law, cannot forgive even his blood. The sins of family are threats to empire. The bloodline must appear divine, even if its members are merely human. So the world watches the emperor's house with the fascination of worshippers at a funeral pyre. They see Augustus, the god made old, Livia, the serpent of composure, Tiberius the heir without joy, and somewhere beyond the waves, Agrippa Postumus, a reminder that even divinity cannot cure the madness of inheritance. Rome whispers, who will rule when Augustus dies? The question is dangerous even to ask, but it hums beneath every conversation, every Senate meeting, every gladiatorial cheer. The empire has never survived the death of its god before. The future feels like a cliff's edge, its fog hiding both salvation and ruin. Tiberius, ever dutiful, continues to serve. He governs, commands, and yields when expected, but inside him burns something dark and quiet. A sense that the empire is not his to inherit but to bear, like a curse passed down through the veins of men who mistake dominion for destiny. He obeys Augustus's every command, yet each act of obedience deepens the gulf between them. Augustus cannot see the man behind the mask. Tiberius cannot forgive the god who forces him to wear it. And Livia watches. She has lived through emperors and wars, through exile and glory, through the decay of love into policy. Her eyes see the empire as no man can, not as a nation or a divine project, but as a living body, made of shifting loyalties, sustained by appearances. She knows her husband's time is nearly over, and she prepares the ground for her son's ascension. Where Augustus ruled through reverence, Tiberius will rule through fear. It is not ideal, but it is survival. The tragedy of the dynasty is not that it fails to endure, but that it endures only by devouring itself. The blood of gods becomes the currency of suspicion. Love becomes propaganda. The empire becomes a household drama scaled to the size of the world. In the evenings, Augustus sits by the gardens of his Palatine home, staring into the dusk. The air smells of olives and dust. The city hums below, eternal and indifferent. He thinks of Gaius and Lucius, of how he once dreamed they would rule together, young and brilliant, twin heirs to his peace. Now he speaks their names only in silence. Somewhere far away, on an island surrounded by endless sea, Agrippa Postumus stares at the horizon, unaware that he will never see Rome again. In the capital, Tiberius receives new honors, new powers, tribuneship, imperium, the subtle architecture of succession tightening around him. And in the corridors of the imperial palace, Livia's footsteps echo softly, almost musically, as if keeping time with the slow, deliberate heartbeat of empire. The dynasty survives, but in surviving it has already begun to die. The gods of Rome demand continuity, not mercy, and in the house of Augustus, the cost of eternity is paid in blood thicker than the Tiber. The air of Rome had grown heavy with ceremony. Every decree, every gesture, every word from the Senate carried the weight of performance. It was no longer a city ruled by conviction, but by choreography. Men in white togas spoke of liberty while kneeling before power. Poets sang hymns to virtue while the prisons filled with those who spoke too freely. The marble gleam of the forum reflected not the light of reason but the sheen of obedience. The Republic still lived, in symbols, in speeches, in the solemn rituals of the Senate, but its pulse was faint, almost decorative. Augustus had ensured it survived in form, so that his monarchy might wear its corpse as a mask. The old offices endured, but their meaning was drained, like statues standing long after the gods they represented had vanished. Beneath this choreography of reverence, fear moved like an unseen current. The city's great families watched one another with careful civility, their rivalries disguised as friendship. The Solani, the Lepidi, the Pisanes, all circled the throne like planets bound by invisible gravity. Every gesture toward Augustus was half prayer, half calculation. Loyalty was not devotion, but insurance. In this atmosphere of perfection, a single rumor could ruin a life. The private became political, the household a battlefield. Moral virtue was no longer a matter of conscience but a weapon wielded by the state. Adultery, impiety, or indiscretion, all could be recast as rebellion. Augustus' moral reforms, once meant to restore old Roman dignity, had become tools of silent terror. It was this moral theatre that swallowed Julia the Younger, granddaughter of Augustus, once the laughter of Rome. Her downfall was not merely a scandal but a public purification. She had broken the facade, dared to be human where divinity was expected. Her exile to the rocky coast of Rhegium was a sermon to the populace. The gods may forgive passion, but the empire will not. Ovid too became an offering to the same altar. His poetry, playful and irreverent, had danced too close to truth. The Ars Semitoria mocked the rigidity of the emperor's virtue, teaching Rome's youth the very art Augustus wished forgotten. Then came the error, the mysterious offense that sealed his fate. Perhaps it was knowledge he should not have had, a glimpse behind the imperial mask. Whatever the cause, he was banished to the frozen edges of the Black Sea, to live out his years writing elegies to a city that pretended not to hear him. His exile was not the punishment of a poet. It was a message to all who dared to imagine Rome as something other than divine order. The Senate watched these exiles in silence. They had long since learned that silence was the highest form of self-preservation. Those who spoke too boldly were reminded that Rome's justice now served its ruler, not its laws. The trials of the moral courts became spectacles, the accused paraded as sacrificial offerings to the god of stability. Guilt was less a verdict than a convenience. Augustus rarely needed to raise his voice. His authority was so absolute that doubt itself seemed sacrilegious. Yet within him lingered a strange unease. The mechanisms he had built, the laws, the magistrates, the propaganda, had taken on a life of their own. The machine of empire no longer required his will to function. It required only his image. The emperor's power was immortal, but the emperor was not. Tiberius, now his second in command, navigated this machinery with silent precision. He spoke little in Senate meetings, his face unreadable, his tone respectful to the point of irony. He understood that in Rome, restraint was a kind of dominance. Each pause, each quiet glance, each refusal to flatter, was a statement of strength. The senators who once mocked him as dour and humorless, now feared his stillness. His absence of charm was his armor. As Augustus's health declined, Tiberius became the living embodiment of the system, a man more machine than flesh. He did not command affection, he demanded endurance. His governance was efficient, cold and impersonal, like a bureaucratic god. The soldiers admired his discipline, the administrators his reliability, but the people felt only distance. Augustus had ruled by love. Tiberius would rule by silence. Within the palaces, intrigue continued. The coins bearing the faces of both Augustus and Tiberius circulated through the empire, two profiles, one old, one ascendant. To the people, it was a sign of continuity. To those within the imperial circle, it was an omen. Dual images on a coin were not partnership. They were succession written in metal. Around this imagery, the factions of Rome gathered their courage and their fear. The Lentuli and Pisanus, loyal to Tiberius, maneuvered quietly into power, taking key governorships in Spain and Africa. Others, those who still whispered the name of Agrippa Postumus, plotted in vain from the shadows. Their champion, the forgotten grandson of Augustus, languished in exile. His existence alone was treason enough. Yet even as the machinery of loyalty solidified, Rome's soul drifted further from its origin. The city that once gloried in eloquence and debate now revered obedience. The Senate's oratory had become an echo, fine words without conviction. When senators praised the emperor, they did so not to persuade, but to survive. The act of speaking truth had become dangerous. In this suffocating atmosphere, the Roman elite found strange ways to breathe. They turned to omens, to astrology, to private cults, promising glimpses of fate. The stars, at least, could not be censored. Even Livia, ever composed, kept her private augurs, though she would deny it before the Senate. Rome's obsession with destiny grew in proportion to its loss of freedom. If men could no longer shape their future, they would read it instead. Augustus, confined more and more to his villa at Nola, watched this transformation from afar. He could no longer walk the streets or address the crowds. His words came now through proclamations, dictated and delivered by others. He had built a system to preserve order, but in doing so, he had ensured his own irrelevance. Rome no longer needed Augustus, only the idea of him. That realization haunted him. He had become the ultimate paradox, a god who could not die without shattering the faith that sustained him, yet could not live without seeing his divinity consumed by those who worshipped it. His name would outlive him, but the soul behind it was already fading. Outside the palace, Rome's markets continued to buzz. Grain shipments arrived from Egypt. New coins shone in the hands of merchants. The games filled the amphitheaters with noise. To the masses, the empire appeared untouched, eternal. But beneath that surface, the moral decay that had once consumed the Republic was stirring again. Only now, it wore the face of virtue. The shadow of the Senate stretched long across the forum at dusk. The marble figures of the gods stood motionless, their faces serene, unseeing. The orators had gone home. The scrolls were sealed, the decrees written in the emperor's name. All was as it should be, orderly, obedient, immaculate. And yet, in that silence, the city seemed to breathe differently. The empire had achieved peace, but it was the peace of glass, shining, perfect, and one tremor away from ruin. Rome, in its magnificence, had become a reflection of its ruler, immortal in appearance, hollow in truth. The Republic was dead. Its corpse, embalmed in ritual and reverence, still stood before the people, and the people, too accustomed to worship, could not tell the difference. The summer of his last year began like a whisper, the kind that trembles at the edge of eternity. The air in Campania was thick with heat and myrrh, the smell of incense and slow decay. Augustus, once radiant as the dawn, now moved like a relic through his own legend. The marble god turned fragile flesh. His hands, which had signed empires into existence, now trembled when he held the stylus. Even the courtiers who had spent their lives rehearsing devotion began to watch him not as a ruler, but as an omen. He had outlived everyone who once knew him as a man. Agrippa, Maecenas, Antony, even the poets who sang his glory, all were gone. The empire, once a living experiment, had hardened into a monument. It needed no architect now, only maintenance. Augustus knew this, though he never said it aloud. He had built eternity, and eternity had no use for the mortal who created it. At Nola, the villa of his youth, he began to fade. He had returned there under the pretense of rest, but everyone understood this was the descent. The gods were calling back their masquerader. Tiberius was summoned from the north, his arrival delayed by caution or by calculation. Between them the air was thick with unspoken truth. Augustus had made him his son by adoption, but never by affection. Now, in the dim light of evening, he reached for Tiberius's hand, and felt only the chill of duty. Outside the villa, the world paused to breathe. The legions on the frontiers waited for word, the Senate for orders, the provinces for signs in the heavens. Rome had forgotten how to exist without him. Even the stars seemed to hesitate. And when, on the 19th of August, his breathing faltered and finally ceased, the silence that followed was not grief but disbelief. They say Tiberius wept beside the bed, that he whispered something to the corpse before the physicians covered its face. Some said he murmured a prayer, others that he swore an oath, but there were those who claimed, quietly, never in public, that he asked forgiveness. For what, none could say. Word of the emperor's death spread slowly, like a ripple across the sea. Messengers galloped down the Appian Way, bearing tidings wrapped in imperial seals. At every town, officials came forth to hear the news. Some wept, some merely bowed, but most looked to the horizon, waiting for what would come next. For all his divinity, Augustus had been a single mortal point of order in a restless world. Without him, that order trembled. Tiberius took command at once, with the precision of a soldier and the patience of a spider. He arranged the oaths of loyalty to be renewed across the empire, demanded no declarations of grief beyond the required ceremonies, and insisted that Augustus's will be read only upon his arrival in Rome. It was all done according to law, precisely, meticulously, as though legality could replace sanctity. The body was borne northward, the journey a kind of living funeral. Through every colony and municipium, the Beria passed from the hands of local dignitaries to those of the next town's elite. Flowers were scattered, hymns sung, and in every place the people watched the passing of their god. The emperor's face was veiled, but the golden eagle standard glimmered above him, the symbol of victory, now repurposed for death. By the time the procession reached Rome, the city was a theatre of mourning. The Senate met under guarded eyes. Livia, dressed in mourning white, sat composed and silent, her expression unreadable. She had lost a husband, but gained eternity. Her title, Augusta, was now inseparable from divinity itself. She would never remarry. She would never need to. Her husband's apotheosis was her own. The funeral unfolded as spectacle. The body lay in state before being carried to the Forum. Tiberius gave the first oration before the temple of Dives Julius, the very place where Caesar had been burned and deified. His speech was restrained, stately, each word carefully measured to avoid sentiment or ambition. Then came Drusus, his son, young and handsome, his voice clear and earnest. Where Tiberius was marble, Drusus was flesh, and the people, hearing him, began to whisper of future gods. The body was borne beyond the Pomerium, to the Campus Martius. There, beneath the setting sun, a pyre rose high into the air, adorned with garlands and eagles wrought of gold. When the flames took hold, an eagle, living and terrified, was released into the sky, as though carrying his soul toward the heavens. The crowd gasped, then roared. In that moment, the man became myth. Livia knelt beside the ashes for 5 days, refusing to eat or speak. Whether it was grief or theatre, none could tell. Rome preferred not to question. The Senate soon met again, and in that chamber of marble and smoke, they declared what had already been decided in their hearts. Augustus was now a god. The motion passed without opposition. It could not have been otherwise. The Senate's acclamation was not merely an act of devotion. It was a transaction. To deify Augustus was to sanctify the system he had built. If he was divine, then all that followed him, the laws, the titles, the succession, became sacred inheritance. The emperor's death was the final perfection of his control. The republic had been reborn as religion. Tiberius, standing before the Senate as the new princeps, performed his reluctance with the precision of an artist. He refused the titles, declined the honors, begged to be excused from so heavy a burden. His words trembled with humility. His eyes, however, were calm and still. He knew the script. Augustus had written it long ago. The theatre of modesty, the illusion of choice. The senators, in their rehearsed outrage, insisted that he must accept. Rome could not live without a father. The gods had chosen him. Finally he relented, not as conqueror, but as servant. It was a lie, everyone agreed to believe. Outside the chamber, whispers coiled through the streets. Some claimed Augustus' death had not been natural. Others muttered of secret orders carried to Planasia, where Agrippa Postumus, the discarded grandson, still lived in exile. They said a centurion had arrived there with imperial authority and left with blood on his sword. The timing was convenient, the motives unclear. Tiberius denied it publicly, but denial in Rome was only another kind of confirmation. In the months that followed, statues of the deified Augustus appeared across the empire. His temples rose beside those of Jupiter. His image was worshipped in the provinces by soldiers and slaves alike. The living emperor ruled beside the dead god, their powers intertwined. Every prayer to Augustus was a pledge of loyalty to Tiberius. The divine and the political had become one and the same, yet even as the empire celebrated its new eternity, a faint unease lingered. The people loved Augustus because he had promised peace. They obeyed Tiberius because they feared disorder. The transition was smooth, but something essential had changed. The warmth of worship had turned to chill obedience. On the Palatine, Livia sat alone in her garden, watching the smoke rise from the altars below. Somewhere beyond the city, the last echoes of the funeral hymns still drifted across the fields. She had won everything she ever desired: power, survival, immortality. But in the stillness, she must have known what all victors learn: that eternity is a lonely crown. Rome slept beneath its new god, the air heavy with incense and control. The marble gleamed brighter than ever, reflecting a peace that was no longer human but divine, and therefore unchallengeable. The age of Augustus had ended not with rebellion or ruin, but with applause, and in that applause, Rome sealed its fate. Word of the emperor's death traveled faster than the legions could march, faster even than grief could form. From the palaces of the Palatine to the frozen forests of the frontier, the news rippled through the empire like the first tremor of an earthquake. The god was dead, and the living were left to remember how to breathe without him. In Pannonia, where the air was heavy with the scent of horses and iron, soldiers laid down their tools of labor. They had been repairing roads, digging trenches, building the skeleton of empire, not for glory, but for order. When the word reached them, their discipline dissolved. Quintus Junius Blasus, their commander, permitted mourning, a fatal mercy. Discipline, once loosened, does not return easily. Among the ranks was a man named Pescennius, a former stage actor turned soldier by poverty and press gang. His voice, trained to carry through amphitheaters, now rose in the camp like a prophet's. He spoke of injustice, of the endless years of service that turned men old before their sons could remember their faces, of promises made by emperors and never fulfilled. His words burned through the ranks, feeding a hunger that had been years in the making. By nightfall, the camp was a riot. Centurions were dragged from their tents, flogged, mocked, thrown into the river. The standards trembled in the torchlight, as oaths were broken and new ones sworn, not to Rome, not to Tiberius, but to the nameless fellowship of the angry and the forgotten. At the same time, across the Rhine, another sickness was spreading. 4 legions, hardened men stationed in the wet forests of Germania, heard the same news and saw the same opportunity. Their commander, Aulus Caecina Severus, made the same mistake as Blasus. He waited. In Rome, hesitation was policy. On the frontier, it was death. The Rhine legions had spent years avenging the shame of Teutoburg, years marching through mud and bone for a cause they no longer understood. To them, Augustus' death meant the end of obligation, the shattering of the spell that held the empire together. With the divine father gone, obedience was merely habit, and habit had grown thin. Into this storm stepped Germanicus, young, charismatic, beloved. His face seemed cut from the old Roman ideal, his name a reminder of triumphs past. He was the blood of Augustus, the darling of the army, and the last ember of Rome's mythic age. The men saw in him the ghost of the old god reborn. But Germanicus was not ready for the world he inherited. His arrival at the Rhine was greeted with cheers that felt more like demands. He addressed the legions with dignity, reminding them of Rome's greatness, of their own duty. But the words of Augustus no longer carried weight, even when spoken by his kin. The soldiers showed their scars, the stumps of their limbs, the faded tattoos of old campaigns. They demanded gold, land, release, not speeches. When Germanicus refused to lead them in rebellion, or to march on Rome, they laughed. Some jeered. A few shouted his name as emperor. The young general froze. To refuse was disloyalty. To accept was treason. He drew his sword and held it to his chest, declaring he would rather die than betray his father's heir. The crowd watched, half amused, half ashamed, as his officers restrained him. It was a performance of loyalty, but the mask cracked. In Rome, Tiberius received word, and did nothing. Or rather, he appeared to do nothing. He understood the mathematics of perception. To intervene too quickly would suggest panic. To move too slowly, weakness. Instead, he sent his son Drusus in Pannonia, with a handful of Praetorian cohorts, and a single letter, a gesture designed to display calm mastery while keeping his own hands clean. The letter, read aloud before the assembled mutineers, was formal and cold. It spoke of duty, of patience, of the emperor's grief and his trust in their loyalty. To men who had lived half their lives in mud and blood, it sounded like mockery. Shouts rose, stones flew. The messengers barely escaped alive. That night, an eclipse darkened the sky. The soldiers, superstitious and half-drunk with fury, took it as an omen that the gods had turned their faces away. Drusus seized the moment. He called the centurions who still commanded respect and whispered of divine anger, of sacrilege. Fear spread faster than rebellion. At dawn, the soldiers who had shouted loudest began to pray, to beg forgiveness. By evening, the mutiny had broken like a fever, but the Rhine was different. There the revolt did not die of superstition. It fed on itself, consuming reason. The mutiny spread like plague. Camps burned, discipline collapsed. Veterans, forgotten for decades, rose from their poverty to join the chaos. The countryside was ravaged, towns looted. The legions, once the empire's shield, had become its executioners. Germanicus, desperate to restore order, forged a letter in the name of Tiberius, granting the soldiers' demands: shorter service, double pay, discharge for the veterans. He even raided his own household treasury to pay them. The lie worked for a time, long enough for him to reassert command. When word of this deception reached Rome, Tiberius's calm cracked. To him, Germanicus's improvisation was not genius, but insolence. The young general had solved a crisis, but in doing so, had made himself indispensable. The emperor never forgave usefulness in others. Then came the reckoning. In the camps of the Lower Rhine, the soldiers who had gone too far began to sense their doom. Germanicus returned with iron in his voice. He ordered the ringleaders dragged from their tents and executed before their comrades. Some died silently. Others screamed confessions that filled the air with guilt. The earth drank their blood, and the soldiers watched, their faces pale in the torchlight. When the killing was done, Germanicus' army demanded to march, not for Rome, but for redemption. They begged him to lead them into Germania once more, to avenge the lost legions of Varus. The young general hesitated, then agreed. Vengeance, at least, could cleanse the stain of mutiny. In Rome, Tiberius feigned approval, but his heart turned to ice. He saw in Germanicus the future, too bright, too beloved, too alive. The empire had room for only one god at a time. As the legions crossed the Rhine once more, their shields glinting in the pale sun, the forests loomed before them like a memory made flesh. Somewhere beyond those trees, the bones of Augustus's lost soldiers lay buried, the last witnesses of a time when the empire believed itself eternal. Now their sons marched to reclaim honor, though none could say for whom: for Rome, for vengeance, or for their own absolution. The fires of rebellion had been quenched, but the embers glowed. In the quiet halls of the Palatine, Tiberius read the reports by lamplight, his expression unreadable. He had inherited an empire bound together, not by faith, but by fear. The gods were gone, the machinery remained. And as the night deepened, the emperor who had inherited eternity realized that peace was not the absence of war, only its pause. Rome slept uneasily. The legions would march again, and with them the last illusion of the divine would die. At dawn, the river mists of the Rhine rose like ghosts, pale and silent, curling through the blackened remnants of campfires. The earth was still red from the slaughter. The mutinies had been quenched, but not forgiven. The camps smelled of iron and smoke and something darker: shame. Germanicus walked among his men, no longer the golden boy of Rome, but a man forged in contradiction, adored, feared, distrusted. Around him the legions were silent, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. The blood they had spilled, comrades, friends, commanders, could never be called discipline again. It was only atonement. The empire demanded purification, and so they would march. Across the Rhine, beyond the boundary of civilization, lay the memory of catastrophe, the dark forest where Varus and his legions had vanished into the mud, where the eagles of Rome had fallen into barbarian hands. To march into Germania was to step into the grave of an empire's pride. Yet the soldiers needed it. They needed to believe redemption could still be earned with the sword. Germanicus understood this. He gave them what they craved, a crusade against memory. The campaign would not be strategy, it would be ritual, the cleansing of betrayal with violence. When the legions crossed the river, they did so with a reverence once reserved for the altars of the gods. Standards gleamed in the half-light, drums beat slow and low, not the rhythm of triumph, but of penance. The forests ahead seemed endless, their silence ancient, as though they remembered every Roman who had died within them. The march was brutal. The roads dissolved into marsh. Rain fell for days without pause. The trees pressed close like sentinels, their branches whispering in the wind. The soldiers, caked in mud, trudged forward through country that seemed to reject them. Germania was not a land to be conquered. It was a wound, and Rome was trying to reopen it. Germanicus rode at the head, his armor dark with rain, his face set in a calm that was half command, half despair. He had become a figure of legend, even before he earned it. The avenger of Varus, the son of Tiberius, the echo of Augustus. His presence was both solace and danger. To love him was to risk treason, to defy him was to risk the god's wrath. At Teutoburg, the forest opened into a clearing of horrors. The wind carried the smell of decay that had not faded in years. Skulls hung from trees, nailed there by tribes who worshipped victory through remembrance. Rusted weapons lay scattered in the undergrowth. Fragments of Roman armor protruded from the mud like bones. In the center of the field stood the remnants of the great pyre where Varus's men had been burned, a blackened altar to Rome's humiliation. The soldiers froze. Some wept, others knelt. Germanicus dismounted and walked into the clearing alone. He did not speak. He knelt before the bones, scooped a handful of soil, and let it fall through his fingers. Then, in silence, he ordered burial. For 3 days, the legions dug graves for the dead of a decade past. They interred skulls without names, limbs without owners. Priests murmured the old rites. When it was done, Germanicus lifted his standard high, and swore that the eagles would rise again. It was not conquest. It was communion, Rome reclaiming its dead. The campaign that followed was both glorious and futile. Germanicus led his armies deep into the heart of Germania, torching villages, slaughtering tribes, driving his men beyond endurance. Each victory was sung as vengeance, but the land swallowed it whole. Forests regrew over ashes, rivers carried the blood away. For every tribe defeated, another rose in its place. Germania could not be conquered because it refused to be named. In Rome, Tiberius read the dispatches with a tightening jaw. The triumphs described in the letters were too radiant, too beloved. The people whispered of Germanicus as the new Alexander, the chosen son of the empire's spirit. Crowds gathered to hear tidings of his victories. Senators praised him in speeches that sounded too much like prayers. The emperor felt it all like a slow, deliberate insult. Power has its own superstition. It cannot bear rivals, even loyal ones. And Germanicus, though loyal, shone too brightly. Tiberius began to recall him. The orders came disguised as honors, new commands, new titles, new responsibilities. But beneath them lay suspicion. When Germanicus returned to the Rhine, he found his authority hollowed. Trusted officers were replaced by men loyal to the emperor. Among them was Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, governor of Syria, sent ostensibly to assist but in truth to watch. The tension between them grew like a sickness. Piso was the embodiment of imperial will, polished, cruel, efficient. Germanicus was the embodiment of everything it feared, charisma without calculation, loyalty without ambition. Between them, the empire's two natures collided, power as duty, power as devotion. In the east, where Germanicus was sent next, the conflict turned fatal. He traveled through Greece and Egypt, greeted by crowds who hailed him as the true heir of Augustus. His mere presence drew worship. In the temples of Alexandria, he defied Tiberius's orders by unveiling sacred statues forbidden to any but the emperor. The gesture was not rebellion, but it was enough to look like one. Piso sent reports dripping with accusation. When Germanicus fell ill in Antioch, the rumor spread faster than the fever. He had been poisoned. The people said, poisoned by Piso, by imperial order, by fate itself. He wasted away in the house where he lodged, his body shrinking as though the empire itself had devoured him. His wife, Agrippina, never left his side. She gathered their children around his bed, the heirs of two gods, and whispered prayers in a voice stripped of tears. Germanicus, delirious, called for loyalty, not vengeance. He died before the end of the season, his youth preserved in death as no life could preserve it. When his body returned to Rome, the city erupted in mourning, processions filled the streets, women tore their hair, men cursed the emperor's name. It was the first true grief Rome had felt since Augustus's death, and it was grief turned against the living. Tiberius watched from the Palatine, his face as still as carved stone. He spoke of sorrow, but no one believed him. The Senate demanded justice. Piso was accused, tried, and before sentence could be passed, found dead, whether by his own hand or another's, no one knew. The truth dissolved into rumor, and rumor hardened into myth. Germanicus became a symbol of what Rome had lost, its innocence, its beauty, its belief that virtue could still survive within power. Statues of him were raised in every province. Poets called him the last Roman. The people left offerings at his image, whispering prayers as though to a saint. In the shadows of the palace, Tiberius ruled on. His face no longer appeared on the coins beside another's. His name alone gleamed in the inscriptions of power. But his sleep was haunted by the roar of a distant crowd, calling a dead man's name. The empire had been avenged. Germania lay scorched, and its ghosts buried. Yet in burying them, Rome had exhumed its own. The bones of its faith, the ruin of its gods. The eagle had risen again, but its wings were heavy with ashes. In the years that followed, Rome forgot how to weep. Statues replaced memories, rituals replaced mourning. Germanicus's name became legend, his virtues carved into stone, his death reduced to lesson. Tiberius reigned, grey and withdrawn, ruling through letters and fear, an emperor haunted not by rebellion, but by the ghost of affection. The empire endured as Augustus had wished, vast and orderly, but hollow. Where once men had dreamed of divinity, now they worshipped survival. And somewhere, beyond the frontiers, the forests still whispered with the memory of lost eagles and lost souls, the echo of Rome's impossible promise. Peace had been achieved, but at the cost of wonder. The gods were gone, the empire remained. And that, perhaps, was the greatest triumph, and the final tragedy, of Augustus's Rome. In the end, the story of Augustus and his heirs is the story of power itself, born in vision, sustained by ritual, and doomed by its own perfection. From the twilight of an aging god to the poisoned dawn of his successors, Rome's golden peace was never peace at all, but the stillness before collapse, a world built on obedience, myth, and the longing to outlive mortality. Augustus dreamed of eternity, and achieved it, but eternity came at a cost. His empire endured, stripped of its soul, its gods replaced by bureaucracy, its glory by memory. In the ashes of Germanicus's pyre, and the silence of Tiberius's court, the age of men became the age of systems, a Rome that would live forever, and never truly live again. If you've been moved by this journey through the twilight of Rome's first empire, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to follow us into the next story of ambition, downfall, and the fragile myths that hold civilizations together.